They're like, well, what's a housing bubble? Essentially, a bubble is when there's easy money and easy credit available, and you get more people bidding for one particular item, and they can bid the price up. I mean, that's the basic idea of there being a bubble. That there is an easy opportunity to get money or credit because interest rates are low or whatever. And so you get more people involved in bidding up the price of properties. I mean, the housing bubble is a classic example. And we're talking about literally somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion worth of mortgages that have soured or that are being held on the books of these big banks that are pretty much worthless because over the course of a decade, there was an increasingly, well, half a decade, really from the early 2000s until about 2007, there was access not only to easy money in the form of low interest rates, but in all these teaser mortgages and teaser rates and ARMs and subprime mortgages, so that people who didn't have the ability to, with their own capital and their own monies, purchase a home, put down 10% or whatever, could get access to credit, access to debt, right, and could purchase these properties. But of course, they were never going to be able to repay them because they didn't have the income or the capital to be able to service their debt. But the banks didn't care about that. And the folks who were underwriting the mortgages didn't care about that because they were getting their money up front. They were getting a commission. They were making money on commissions, and so they didn't care about the long-term impact of people not being able to repay these debts. That's the essence of a bubble. And so when Terry asks, is there any way to stop the Fed's efforts at creating cheap money for the purpose of blowing bubbles? The answer is no. There's no way. Eventually, the economy itself will stop. The economy is self-limiting. All pyramid schemes, all Ponzi schemes are self-limiting. Eventually, they collapse. And this is the worst one ever, Terry. In the history of civilization, we've never seen a situation in which this much debt, both public and private, has existed in the world. We've never seen debt to GDP ratios like we see now. Never, ever. Dwarfs the Great Depression of the 1930s, dwarfs it. And yet the American people sit back and they drink their coffee. Now, mind you, which I don't think is a bad thing. Whew, that's strong. And they live in this somnambulant world where everything is going to be okay. It's like the movie Repo Man. Did you ever see Repo Man, Terry? Great movie with Emilio Estevez. The life of a repo man is always intense. Harry Dean Stanton. Well, there's a scene in Repo Man where Emilio Estevez comes home to his family, his mom and dad, and they're sitting in front of the TV, and they're looking all beatific and very happy. And Emilio Estevez says, I could use some money, Mom and Dad. And Mom and Dad are sitting on the couch staring off going, we gave it all to the preacher. We gave it all to the guy, the televangelist on TV because he's so wonderful. Like in a dream world, like not dealing with reality. And Emilio Estevez is like, oh, great, thanks a lot, Mom and Dad. And of course, he has a can of food that says food on it. He's like, there's great food. Thanks for the food. You got to see Repo Man. It's a classic. Anyway, that's what the American people, that's where they're living right now. That's where you are living, American people. Norwich residents and Hartford residents and other people out there. I'm not saying all of you, but a lot of you think that because we've never had this kind of a crisis before, and because we are the United States, and because you've always been able to go to the grocery store and buy whatever you wanted to buy, and that it's always going to be that way. And you know what? You are wrong. You're ignoring the science of mathematics. You're listening to the shaman and snake oil salesman of the world of economics and politics, and you're ignoring the science of mathematics. Mathematics tells us that this is going to end very badly. Mathematics and the science of debt tells us that this is going to collapse. This year? No. Next year? Down the road, 5 or 10 years? Has to. It has to, because there's no way to prop up a pyramid scheme unless you get more buy-in from people who go further into debt in order to buy more into. That's what the government is trying to do. That's why the $8,000 tax credits. I have a friend who's putting, building up stuff in their house because they're getting tax credits for, home improvements. That's what the government wants. The government wants you to go further into debt with regard to your ability to get these tax credits so that you get buy-in. The government doesn't care that Goldman's the other day, last week, purchased 1,000 S&P contracts to artificially boost the markets so that people trading around the country, day traders and others, would buy in, because the government can use those statistics and say, hey, look, the stock market's going up. We've got recovery. Folks, all this is a recovery pumped by government spending. But government has no productive capital to spend. They're just printing it and borrowing it. Mathematics tells us this has to end badly. But unfortunately, the American people are used to things not ending badly. The American people are used to things ending badly for other people. Look, how long has it been since there was conflagration on the streets of the United States? How long has it been since the U.S. faced enemies that were 100 years? Could you say the Civil War? Could you say the War of 1812? Where was Vietnam fought? Vietnam. Where's Iraq? The Iraq War. Iraq. Afghanistan. Afghanistan. How long has it been since we saw real strife and we just don't know what it feels like to actually have reality smack us in the face. And so here we are believing that there's this thing called economic recovery, and yet the mathematics of the situation is that we're talking about $2.5 trillion in private debt out of a GDP of some 14.3 trillion. We're talking about 13 some odd trillion dollars in government debt, which is equal in essence to our gross domestic product. We're talking about deficits of over $1 trillion. We're talking about a system in which there are no laws that are regulatory laws, regulations that are governing the actions of the Ponzi makers. Oh, I'm sorry, the market makers on Wall Street. This has to end badly. It always has, and it always will. Ponzi schemes always collapse in the end, and quantitative easing and our efforts at recovery is the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of civilization. Whew, need some coffee. Let's go back to camera one and answer another question. Hello. Angry Moderate here, and we're working into the second half hour of our show. Now, not only does the Angry Moderate speak of himself in the third person, but in the plural, in the regal, maybe not so regal, plural. We, the Angry Moderate, and our multiple personalities, will take another question. Let's see what we've got here. Randy from San Marcos, Texas. Randy from San Marcos, Texas asks, Dan, there is a lot of back and forth on deficits. Where do you stand? Do they matter? Now, wasn't it, what was the vice president there, Dick Cheney, who made the comment? Oh, sorry, camera number two. You can't get used to that. So Dick Cheney, the vice president back with George W. Bush, made the comment that deficits don't matter. Now, I want to have a conversation, a moderate conversation about deficits, not a politically charged, ideologically charged, or ideologically charged left-wing or right-wing, just a conversation about deficits. Cheney made an interesting comment. He said, look, spending deficits don't matter. And there are economists out there called post-Keynesians, I know, sorry, and modern monetary theorists, MMTers, I know, who believe that the benefit of deficits is that for every dollar we have in deficit with regard to our economy, those are reflected in savings of the people. So if you start to trim down deficits, then you raise taxes and you eliminate people's savings and or the money that they can use to spend. So there are people out there who think that high deficits are not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, there was an op-ed in the Valley News just yesterday written by an economist from the University of Texas named Galbraith. I believe he's the son of the famous John Kenneth Galbraith, and I believe his name is James, who's trying to convince us that, look, deficits are not bad because essentially for every dollar you have in deficit, those are dollars that citizens have saved or are not having to spend on taxes or on paying back the deficit. And so there are a lot of arguments made by people out there that deficit hawks, the people in Congress and around the world who are like, we've got to reduce our deficits, that those people are willing to drive us into a deflationary depression in order to balance the books. Are you with me on that? Now, Randy asked me, where do I stand on deficits? And I want to say that this is a very interesting question because we have to think about it in terms of time, right? This is a four-dimensional question. Remember the old Tesseract, four dimensions, right? Again, I like to refer to Star Trek in terms of the fourth dimension, the temporal dimension. So in terms of time, deficits are important because they impact people's belief in their currency, in their irredeemable currency. As deficits grow, the bond market reacts to deficits. People react to deficits in terms of their belief in the currency, and you can get extraordinary and instantaneous currency crises, bank runs, people all of a sudden a mass hysteria over the fact that debt and deficit have expanded to the point where people no longer have confidence in their currency. Now remember, there is a difference between national debt and deficit. Deficit is sort of a year-on-year measure of money coming in and money going out. So I think in the long term, running high deficits is extraordinarily bad and extraordinarily dangerous to the economic welfare, which is kind of an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. There is no economic welfare in this country. We're just kind of hanging on by a thread at this juncture. So I do think that deficits are bad in that sense. However, if in the short term the conservative elements, the deficit hawks in Congress, are able to convince policymakers, their folks in Congress, their brothers and sisters in Congress, policymakers, to vote to cut spending and to trim deficits, that is, in the short term, going to create Great Depression number 2. Now, again, it's a lose-lose situation, folks. It's lose-lose. The classic, there's a no-win scenario here for the people in Washington. It's a Kobayashi Maru, another Star Trek reference. Oh my gosh, I should get money from these. Well, then again. The Kobayashi Maru was a test given to Starfleet commanders or incipient Starfleet commanders that tested their character in no-win situations. It's a no-win for Congress. If they vote to cut spending and to go into this austerity-driven mode, we're going to see unemployment, U3 unemployment, which is not the full measure. U6 is the full measure. It's already at 16%, 17%. We're going to see unemployment skyrocket because the government's not going to be pumping money into the system to keep it alive. Weekend at Bernie's. Remember the dead guy, Bernie? He's dead, but we'll make him look like he's alive, right? And we'll, move his head around and stuff. That's what we've got. We have a Weekend at Bernie's economy. If the government stops pumping in money and we cut spending and we have austerity-driven measures, we're going to see unemployment go through the roof. We're going to see people lose trust or belief in the system immediately, and we're going to be plunged into Great Depression 2, really Great Depression 2, right? But if we can keep the deficits high, and we keep quantitative easing going, and we keep pumping money into the system, and the Federal Reserve keeps buying up the bonds that are offered by the federal government, and we keep creating all of this stimulus, oh yeah, we'll keep the economy alive for a while. We'll create the appearance of there being some sort of economic viability in this country, but in the long run, the collapse will be more precipitous. Precipitous is a very spitty word. Precipitous, sorry, that's gross. There will be more of a calamity. So it's a darned if you do and a darned if you don't, he says, trying not to insult anybody with a four-letter word. It's darned if you do and darned if you don't, says the angry moderate. If you, on the one hand, cut deficits now and go into austerity mode like some folks are thinking about trying to do in Europe, and you're going to create immediately Great Depression 2. And we're going to be in a deflationary spiral that's going to make the Great Depression 1 look like a walk in the park. However, if you kick the can down the road with more quantitative easing and more easy monetary policy with the illusion that, hey, we're going to have 8% GDP growth. Of course, 92% of it is going to be driven by government expenditure. You are going to create down the road an even more calamitous collapse because people are going to stop eventually believing in the currency that exists. And you're going to have, after the deflationary spiral, a hyperinflationary event. You get the picture? Lose-lose. And the reason it's a lose-lose is because we blew it. We blew it. We blew it. The United States blew it. In the early 1970s, when we basically defaulted on our gold obligations and created an irredeemable currency and followed the teachings of John Maynard Keynes and allowed corporations to have do whatever they wanted without any regulatory superstructure, eliminating regulatory superstructure in 1999 with the passage of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, that legislation that eliminated Glass-Steagall. We have eliminated, not only have we eliminated regulation, we have regulatory capture, where we pay off, see, it is a bunch of outlaws, where we pay off regulatory agencies, we pay off those people who are the ratings agencies, Fitch's and the Standard & Poor's, and the ratings agencies to say, hey, yeah, this bundle of bonds is worth a lot of money, you should buy these. We blew it. Greed and avarice and predatory, rapacious, vulturine thinking and existence, we blew it. And we are going to suffer because of it. And you better prepare. Now, I'm not, again, I told you that the Angry Moderate was feeling a little bit conspiratorial today. I think that it transcends conspiracy. I don't think it's really that people literally sit around these, as you read in the blogs where people are like, yeah, it's the Bilderberg people and the bankers, and they're all sitting around and there's a big cauldron. And they're like, no, I don't think that's it at all. I think that it's just greed. And if people have the opportunity to get more for themselves, they do. I mean, my gosh. I think I've mentioned this before. Look at the Woodstock generation, right? Look at all of the rockers who played at Woodstock. How many of them in the 1970s and 1980s said, to heck with revolution, I want to be a multimillionaire? You say you want a revolution. Well, no, I don't. I just want a big mansion on the beach. You get the picture? Anyway. Let's go back to my notes and answer another question, shall we? This is the Angry Moderate here, broadcasting from beautiful downtown White River Junction and drinking coffee from the Tucker box, which, by the way, makes a dark roast that is to die. And if you would like to indulge yourself in this dark roast, I think you should, because this is fantastic. Do you like my Long Island accent? Yeah, I was a high school principal on Long Island. It's true, I was a high school principal on Long Island. People on Long Island don't necessarily look like this, although I didn't last very long on Long Island being a high school principal. I don't think I was particularly made for that environment. However, I certainly was not my best professional experience. Anyway, so we've done Randy, Jim, Michael, Alex, and Terry. All right, we've done the questions. Now we can get to the notes. Let's talk about Barney Frank. Barney Frank, who is a congressman from the state of Massachusetts. Camera 2. Barney Frank is a Democratic representative from the state of Massachusetts. Now, I grew up outside of Boston in Barney Frank's district, the town next to the city that Barney is from. Barney, I think, is from Newton, and I grew up next door. And I really like Barney Frank. I think that his politics are in the right place. I think that he finds what's going on with the banking system as abhorrent. I think he is a man who believes in the right things. I like him. And he's brilliant. Maybe not brilliant. He's wicked smart. Yeah, this guy, he's a very smart man. Barney Frank is being accused by people in the blogosphere, the econo-blogosphere, and conservatives of being in bed, metaphorically, with the banks, in trying to create policies or legislation or impact legislation that is going to be easier on the banks and on the Federal Reserve. And it's true. It's true. Barney Frank is offering up language to legislation that is making its way through the Senate and the House and, conference committee and all that stuff, that is going to weaken, water down, or attempt to water down an audit of the Federal Reserve. A lot of people are accusing Barney Frank of doing this for personal gain, but I know him. I don't know him personally. There's something wrong here, because Barney Frank is a righteous guy. His politics, his belief in human rights, in personal rights, and individual rights are in the right place. Not as a liberal or as a conservative, but simply as a human being. And yet he is trying to work against those forces that would offer an audit of the Federal Reserve or that would create regulation with regard to derivatives in particular that were too strict and stringent. Why would he do that? Would he do that because he's being paid off? Well, that's what a lot of people out there in the econoblogosphere would argue. Oh, he's getting paid off. He's just another criminal. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that simple. I think Barney Frank knows something. And I think he believes something. I think Barney Frank believes that if there were a true audit of the Federal Reserve, and if the people really found out where these trillions of dollars were going, and who was lent money, and who was given money, and who has reserve accounts at the Fed that aren't on the books, and if there was a real audit of the Federal Reserve, that the American population would go, oh, so that's what's been going on. And there would be a currency crisis, and there would be a crisis with regard to the dollar, and we would be plunged into that immediate Great Depression too. So this is a really interesting thing, because Barney Frank, with regard to his watering down any kind of audit of the Fed, is essentially subscribing to the philosophy of extend and pretend. We are going to pretend or extend this situation and pretend there's economic health or recovery or growth, because he's afraid of the opposite. He's afraid of the results of a real audit of the Fed. And this is an interesting thing. You know, I get vilified all the time when I write, for some of the blogs where I say, hey, look, I'm not saying that I'm against an audit of the Fed. I happen to be for a full-on audit of the Federal Reserve. I happen to believe that we have to take our medicine now and figure out ways to come together and work together in our communities, excuse me, to survive what we're going to have to go through anyway. Why kick the can down the road when we can face our mathematical reality that the bed that we have created for the last 30 years of fraud and profligacy and avarice and regulatory cap? Why not deal with it now, come together in our communities, take care of each other, and get a fresh start? But I also understand people who argue to the converse, who say, if we have these austerity measures, if we have these deficit cuts, if we have these cuts in spending, we are going to perpetuate more human suffering. I understand that argument. I think it's a false argument, because I think what it does is it presupposes that somehow we're not going to have that suffering 10 years down the road anyway, because there's still going to be a collapse. I think that that's the false, premise behind the argument. But just because there's a false premise behind the argument doesn't mean it's not a legitimate or genuine argument. So I think that people who vilify Barney Frank are getting it wrong. I think he's got the interest of the nation in his sights. I just think he's making a mistake with regard to how he views maybe down the road we can actually have economic recovery. Folks, we cannot have economic recovery in the way that's being touted by the media and by the government. It just can't happen. It can happen in the short term and maybe in the midterm. But over the long term, these debts have to be repaid. In the long term, the bond market will call the bluff of the United States in our borrowing and printing. Over the long term, when there are austerity measures, there's going to be an acceleration of private sector deleveraging, and that acceleration of deleveraging has to occur. It mathematically must occur. Will precipitate a rise in unemployment, deflationary spiral with regard to the velocity of money, and depression. Sorry, it's just math. It's not economics, really. It's just math. Oh, yes. Tim Geithner, stress tests, and Spain. I need some coffee before I talk about this one. Camera 2. Tim Geithner, Dartmouth graduate. Oh, he's such a disaster. Tim Geithner, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, who single-handedly oversaw the stress tests of American banks, these supposed tests that were going to tell the American, again, extend and pretend, create the illusion of economic health, create the illusion of solvency. Tim Geithner oversees, a stress test on, 26 of the biggest banks in the country or whatever, I'm not sure of the exact number, and comes back with a report that says these banks, the majority of these banks are healthy and solvent. It's a lie. They're healthy and solvent because we aren't allowed to know what's on their books. They're healthy and solvent because they're allowed to mark their assets however they want to. They're healthy and solvent because they're allowed to keep things off their balance sheets. You know, worthless assets, things that are worth pennies on the dollar, if that. I mean, look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They were just delisted by the New York Stock Exchange. But they're under U.S. conservatorship. And so, of course, the idea is, well, the United States can create and print as much money as it wants to, so these things are solvent. No, they're not. Are you kidding me? But the idea, again, is to, in the minds of our policymakers, following, Friedmanite and Keynesian thinking, if you will, is that if we can create the illusion of there being economic health, and if we can create confidence in the system, then we can get people to spend, buy-in, Ponzi scheme, buy-in, and that we can then create growth in our economy. But the stress tests are a lie. And Tim Geithner has basically said to Europe, okay, you guys are going to do stress tests too, and when you do them, you're going to tell everybody that your banks are healthy too, and then when you offer bonds for sale, the European Central Bank, the ECB, will buy them up, and you'll be able to say, hey, look at these great bond market offerings. We've issued, Spain issued 3 billion euros worth of bonds, and they were all purchased. We're recovering, right? No, sorry. It's a fraud, it's a sham, it's an illusion. It's a snake oil deal. It's smoke and mirrors. There's no productive capital in these institutions. Look, Denmark, Finland, nations, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these nations are now on the watch list for being totally broke, for spending beyond their means because they could get access to easy money. And now the European Central Bank is going to be creating trillions of euros, so that everybody will have money. But it's not real. It's entries in computers, and it's the printing. It has no productive capital base. It has no commoditized relationship to any substantive commodity. It's just fiction. And it works as long as you believe it. It works as long as you think that an $8,000 tax credit to buy a home means that you're going to be able to buy a home and there's going to be a new competition for homes, and the cost of your $300,000 home is going to be worth $4 million in 5 years, and then you're going to be able to sell it and live high off the hog. But I hate to tell you, but all of the mathematical data points to the fact that your home that's worth $300,000 now is going to be worth $150,000 in 5 years. Because at some point, all of this printing and all of this creation of this fictitious capital totally devalues that actual, not only does it devalue it proportionally, it devalues it aproportionally, because people just lose all belief in it. Why do you think people are buying up physical gold and physical silver like it's going out of style? Why do you think local currencies are springing up all over the country? Why do you think people are working barter, and there are community gardens and community energy independence? Because people are waking up to the fact that for the last 30 plus years, we've been engaged in the most extraordinary Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme, and economic fraud in the history of civilization. People are waking up to that. Now look, you don't have to wake up to that. You can continue to believe that things are going to be fine. And you know what? That's your business. You can do that. I only say that in terms of your communities, Norwich, Hartford, Vermont, Hanover, New Hampshire, any other communities out there, San Luis Obispo, Claremont, New Hampshire, Teaneck, New Jersey, Bath, Maine, I assume. In your communities, you need to create, I believe, a dialogue and infrastructure and superstructure to deal with the situation as it evolves. Is it going to be next year? Is it going to be the year after? Is it going to be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? We know, those of us who study this obsessively, we know that the mathematics never, ever lie. We know that never in the history of civilization has there been a pyramid scheme that didn't collapse.